Hey there, so in the last video, I made this computer right here. It was my first time building a computer, and pretty much everything went wrong. But after a lot of trial and error, it is up and running now. And today I want to tell you how it performs in some games, and also how is it in normal use. Is it good? Is it bad? Did I pick the wrong parts? Like, who knows? Well, let's find out. Before we get into the benchmarks, let's quickly go over the specs. So, the CPU we are using is the Intel Pentium G7400, which is the 12th generation Intel Pentium. It is the fastest dual-core CPU you can get. On top of that, we also have 32 GB of G.Skill DDR4 RAM running at 3200 MHz. And for the boot drive, I am using a 3TB Western Digital Blue hard drive at 5400 RPM. Before I get into gaming, I want to show you how normal Windows 10 usage is with this hard drive, because a lot of people said the hard drive would be horrible after a few days. And I've been using this computer for over a week now, and the hard drive has fared up just fine. So let's just go over and put Task Manager on the side here, and let's just start opening things. Okay, so let's open up Google. It was already in the cache or whatever you want to call it, but hey, Google opened just fine because I had it open. Okay, what else can I open? The Minecraft launcher, because Minecraft is a somewhat harder game to open. While the game itself is hard to open, I'm not going to be opening that during this recording because okay, never mind, I automatically clicked the button. So, yeah, let's open up Minecraft. Now, opening Minecraft does take a while. It does max the hard drive out for a while, but after a while, it does open. Now, one thing I want to say is, I do know hard drives are not a replacement for an SSD. I'm just saying it is a cheap alternative to an SSD if you don't have enough money for both. But yeah, this will take a hot minute to open up, but while we wait for it to open up, let's open up some more apps, like, for example, Twitter. Now, this will take a little longer to open than it normally would because we're already maxing the hard drive out due to, well, we're opening Minecraft. But as you see, it's already open. What about hardware monitor? Now, your screen went black for a moment while that prompt came up, but as you see, it is popping up just fine here. We can open up MSI Afterburner, another prompt, and any moment now it'll pop up on screen. And you know what? That's not enough. Okay, well let's try to open up another game. Let's try to open up Roblox, for example. This will definitely be a bit harder, but at the same time, it should open up again just fine. Now, if you often turn your computer on and off or shake it around because it's a laptop, then I completely understand why you wouldn't want a hard drive. Or, for example, if you want stuff to be, instant. Of course, there's many reasons why you don't want a hard drive. But for me, it doesn't affect the gaming performance, and as you see, the game's already open. The game's not loading properly right now. It's fine. But as you see here, the game is open. Oh, hi there, person. Oh, we got him. It's not loading in properly right now because we're opening up games right now, and we're doing a lot on the computer, basically. But yeah, we're gonna win this match. Go away. Now, booting Windows takes a rather long time. It takes 3 to 4 minutes to boot. It takes 3 to 4 minutes here. That's fine. The computer doesn't really turn on and off a lot. How are you in the ground, sir? What? Oh, no, go. No. Basically, everything on the computer takes longer than an SSD. At least opening-wise. What even is this? Is this a tortilla weapon or what? Hi. Oh, we got him like that. We came in 4th place. Nice. Okay, that was a sneak peek of how the games work with the graphics card. But first, let's try out the integrated graphics in some games. So, in Roblox Arsenal, with the integrated graphics at 1080p, the game ran around 20 frames per second at the highest settings. But then when you lower the game to the second from the lowest settings, which is basically the lowest settings with a bit of a higher view distance, the game ran at around 120 frames per second the entire time, and it was completely playable. And it was an awesome, what did I just say? And it was an awesome experience. The next game up on the list is BioShock Infinity, or Infinite, and it ran just fine. It was getting around 40 to 50 frames per second on the lowest settings at 1080p, but then when I lowered it to 900p, it was getting around 60 frames per second the entire time. Now, I didn't try 720p because I don't exactly think I would actually play at 720p because the game's already getting around 60 frames per second anyway, and it looks great. The next game up on the list is Borderland 3, and on the absolute lowest settings at 1080p, the game was getting 10 frames per second. So it kind of fits 1080p because 1010, you know? But still, though, it was unplayable. Then I lowered the resolution down to 720p, and I was expecting the game to get at least 30 frames per second here, but no, it wasn't. It was getting 20. So that is definitely something. It's definitely not very playable at 720p. Then I lowered the resolution scaler down to 50%, which will take it down to, if I'm not mistaken, 360p, because it is half of 720p, and it still was not a very good experience. It was getting between 30 and 25 frames per second roughly, so it still can't even really get a smooth 30 at 360p on the lowest settings. Yeah, that is not very good at all. The next game upon the list is Fortnite. Now, loading into a Fortnite game took so long, well, 7 minutes, I managed to fall asleep during the loading time and die in the match, which, I mean, I came in 11th place, which is not half bad for falling asleep. The next match I was determined to not fall asleep, and I didn't, and we were getting around 35 frames per second at 1080p. Then I lowered the game to 720p, and it was getting between 50 and 70 frames per second, and it was also a bit stuttery, though I've not really played Fortnite before, so I don't think that's supposed to happen. Then I tried performance mode, and it was getting actually somehow a worse frame rate, it seemed. It was getting around 30 frames per second. I didn't realize this in the actual testing, but yeah. Performance mode actually somehow performed worse than non-performance mode, which is weird. Still on performance mode, I decided to turn the resolution scale down to 50%, which is 360p, and it was still dipping below 60 frames per second. It was hovering around 50, which is quite weird. Also, the graphics card usage, or iGPU usage, is also not very high. So it is around 60 to 70% usage, which is not ideal. I mean, it would make more sense if it was 100% used, but nope, I guess the drivers on this might not be the best. Then I lowered the resolution scale to 37% of 720p, and that would be 266p, and the game is running pretty much exactly the same. The next game up on the list is BeamNG Drive, and I was on the West Coast USA map with the lowest settings in the game, and also playing at 480p full screen, and the game was getting around 40 to 60 frames per second, which is, to be honest, really impressive. At least to me, that is very impressive, because if you look back at Borderland, we were only getting around 30 frames per second at 360p. So this is an improvement, and it's also a higher resolution. But also, I should add in, the UHD 710 graphics is still not at 100% usage. Instead, it hovers around 69% usage, which is, for some reason, just, I don't know why. The drivers are fully up to date, and the CPU is not the bottleneck here. You will see when we put a graphics card in here, it will get better frame rate. The next game up on the list is Minecraft Java with 12 chunks render distance 1080p with the complementary shaders, and it was getting a whopping 10 frames per second. To be fair, that's actually less than I was expecting, but hey, you know, at least it ran. And once again, we see the iGPU not fully utilized. And also, without shaders, the game was getting between the upper 40 frames per second and lower 80 frames per second. I'm sure if I went over and lowered the resolution, the game would have ran a little bit better, but still though, I don't really want to lower the resolution that much because, well, it's Minecraft. Minecraft is an insanely light game to run, and you shouldn't even have to lower the resolution to play it right. Well, unless you're using a G100, then of course you do. You have to lower it to like 1p or something. Then I decided to try to record with the iGPU, because you can actually do video encoding with this iGPU, which I find quite interesting because like the RX 6400 you can't do video encoding, but on this I was able to record 1080p Minecraft at 30 frames per second while playing Minecraft at 60 frames per second, and I gotta say, it worked pretty decently. Yeah, it was only 30 frames per second, but keep in mind, this is just an iGPU, so that is actually pretty impressive, I gotta say. The next game up on the list is New World, and I was running the game at the absolute lowest settings at 1080p with dynamic resolution scaling turned on, and it was getting between 6 and 8 frames per second. That is horrible. Then I set the resolution to the absolute lowest the game supports, which is 768p, and it was not getting that much better frame rate. It was only getting 13, which is still utterly unplayable. CSGO on the absolute lowest lowest settings at 720p was getting around 70 to 80 frames per second, which is pretty playable, though I just gotta say this again, the iGPU is not at 100% usage. Why? I mean, I don't know how to code stuff, but like, how hard could it be to make an iGPU be fully utilized? I don't know, but yeah, it's only like 80 to 90, which is just triggeringly low, you know what I'm trying to say. But besides that, I had a really nice time playing CSGO on this. But now it's time to put that loser Intel iGPU away, and let's put in something a little bit better. A RTX 3060. So on a Roblox Arsenal, the game was getting around 30 frames per second better. It was getting around 150 frames per second. But the thing is, it was on the absolute highest settings instead of the absolute lowest settings. So that was a quite nice improvement. But all in all, Roblox felt completely fine on the absolute highest settings. Now, there was a few little stutters here and there, which I think would be due to the CPU, but you can actually get rid of the stutters if you cap your frame rate to, let's just say, 100 or 120. BioShock 720p on the lowest settings, which is what we were doing on the iGPU, it was getting around 293 frames per second. Then at 1080p on the absolute highest settings, it was getting between roughly 200 and 210 frames per second. Now, the thing is, it was actually somewhat graphics card bottlenecked here and there. Sometimes it'd be the graphics card, sometimes it'd be the CPU. They take trades basically in this game. But one way or another, the game looks great and it ran great. I'd personally run this on 1440p and it would even look even better, but it still looks great on a 1080p monitor. Borderlands 3 at the absolute highest settings, or the badass preset, was getting around 100 frames per second average at 1080p. Also in this scenario, it is still GPU bottlenecked, so it doesn't actually show how many frames per second the CPU can get. But this is the settings I would actually be playing at with this game anyway, because it just looks great in my opinion. Then I tried Fortnight, and the game was running at roughly 150 frames per second on the absolute lowest settings at 1080p with 100% render resolution scaler in performance mode. And I gotta say, the game ran perfectly fine. It was somewhat stuttery here and there, but the stutteriness, is that how you say it? But the stutters nearly went away if you went over and capped your frame rate to something lower than what your average was. So if you capped it to, like, let's say 100 frames per second or 120, then you'll feel virtually no stutters in the game. Then I tried the game at the absolute highest settings without DLSS and without RTX, and it was running around 100 frames per second. It was getting more stutters than it was before, but it was still a perfectly playable experience, and the game looked quite a bit better. BeamNG Drive West Coast USA 480p on the lowest settings was getting well above 200 frames per second, so yeah, BeamNG Drive ran just fine, at least at the resolution that we were playing at with the iGPU. And at 1080p on the ultra settings with dynamic reflections and all that stuff turned on, the game was still getting around 110 frames per second, and it was still perfectly playable. Now, when you get into downtown West Coast USA, it would go over and, you know, lag some. It would get around 60 to 70 frames per second, but all in all though, for BeamNG Drive, that is a utterly perfectly playable experience, and it was awesome. I do want to note, sometimes it did give you 1 or 2 lag spikes when traveling across the entire map, though, again, like always, capping the frame rate will minimize them. New World 768p on the absolute lowest settings, it was getting around 50 to 70 frames per second, and it was also horribly stuttery. But the thing is, it's actually outperforming my i7-3770K overclocked to 4.4 GHz here. Yeah, I don't know how it has 2 less cores, 4 less threads, and it's also a lower clock speed, but yeah, it's still beating the i7, so that's something. Then I tried the game at 1080p on the absolute highest settings, besides having objects details and shaders details all the way at the lowest, because those actually go over and dip the frame rate down around 20 lower than it actually is normally, which is not what you want in this situation because the game is very hard to run. And with those all the way down, the game was still getting between, let's say, 40 and 60 frames per second. So, not bad, and the game still looks great, so that's nice. Now, if you don't want the stutters, you could go over and lock the game to 45 frames per second or something like that, and you won't really have any stutters. Sometimes you'll have some, but most of them will be gone. And if you want basically no stutters, you could of course lock the game to 30 frames per second. The next game up on the list is CSGO, and the game was getting around 200 plus frames per second at 1080p on the absolute highest settings, which is flawless. I actually got distracted and played the game for about 3 hours straight, and I was doing a benchmark, so that was something. And also, there is video editing. Is video editing any good on this? Does it suck? Is it the worst computer ever when it comes to video editing? Well, the answer is no. I've actually edited the last video and this video on this computer, and it has worked just fine. Now, export times were a little bit long when I specifically used the CPU to export. It took around 4 hours and 20 minutes to export the last video only using the CPU. But for example, if I used the Intel iGPU, or if I went over and used the NVIDIA GPU, the export times would be significantly shortened. Also, I should add in, if you aren't someone who's like the company of Linus Tech Tips making multiple videos a day, it's fine if the videos don't export extremely fast, because, for example, you can still use your computer while a video exports. Yes, it might be slightly slower, but for example, if you go over into Task Manager, go to Details, and then right-click your video editing software and put the priority into Low, then basically your video exporting will be in the low priority, and you can still go over and play games and not really have that big of an FPS hit. And you could have a nice time gaming or just doing really anything while the video is exporting. You don't have to just sit there and stare at the screen while it exports. Also, if you're wondering what the Cinebench R23 score on this is, on multi-core it is around 3,870, and that is with a real-time priority and also with nothing else running in the background at 100% fan speed, and a single core score of 1,425. Also, I'm curious to hear what your opinion is on this computer. Is it performing any better or any worse than you expected, or would you actually think of going out and buying one of these computers? Let me know in the comments below.